History, they say, is written by the victors. But within the sealed drawers of forgotten archives, buried beneath redacted memos and coded transmissions, lies a version of the Second World War that was never meant to surface. These are not the stories celebrated in parades or etched onto monuments. They are not the triumphs replayed in newsreel footage or textbooks. Instead, they are fragments of a darker truth, hidden in shadowed corridors of power, whispered only in rooms without windows. For decades, intelligence agencies on both sides of the Iron Curtain worked tirelessly to conceal evidence that could fracture the very foundation of public trust in the Allied victory. Files stamped top secret and eyes only reveal betrayals within command structures, atrocities covered in silence, and deals struck in smoke-filled offices while the world bled. What you are about to hear has never been spoken aloud to ordinary citizens. It is disturbing, forbidden knowledge. Knowledge that calls into question everything we think we know about good and evil, right and wrong, victory and justice. 5 disturbing truths, long buried, now unearthed. The cost of listening may be nothing less than your trust in history itself. Chapter 1. Classified betrayals within Allied command. In September 1944, Allied forces launched Operation Market Garden, an ambitious plan to secure key bridges in the Netherlands and open a swift route into Germany. The official story recalls brave paratroopers descending on Arnhem, Nijmegen, and Eindhoven, their mission faltering under the weight of unexpected German resistance. Yet documents declassified in fragments decades later suggest that Market Garden's failure was not due to miscalculation alone. Buried within the British SIS archives are intercepts and coded transmissions stamped Black Lantern, hinting at deliberate betrayal within the Allied chain of command. Certain drops were rerouted to the wrong coordinates, supply lines were inexplicably delayed, and promised air cover never arrived. These were not accidents. They bore the marks of sabotage. Among the most disturbing revelations is the presence of double agents operating under codenames still withheld from public release. Figures tied to both the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, and to Soviet operatives under NKVD direction appear in cables sent from neutral Switzerland and Sweden. One document filed under Eyes Only for Supreme HQ reveals that decrypted messages warning of German panzer divisions near Arnhem were received but never distributed to frontline commanders. The implication is chilling. Allied intelligence may have knowingly withheld life-saving information, sacrificing soldiers to preserve a broader strategic design. Historians once dismissed claims of betrayal as conspiracy theory, but internal memoranda from MI6 detail concerns about compromised officers embedded in SHAF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. One such officer, identified in British records only as Source Kestrel, was later linked to covert meetings in Stockholm, where Soviet diplomats and German intermediaries alike were known to exchange intelligence. If the British and American High Command were aware of this and allowed the deception to continue, it raises the possibility that Arnhem was more than a failed gamble. It was a calculated trade-off in the emerging shadow war of East versus West. Field accounts from survivors add a human dimension to the betrayal. Paratroopers of the British 1st Airborne Division, trapped in Arnhem with dwindling supplies, recalled hearing radio transmissions promising reinforcements that never came. American glider units reported supply crates drifting far behind enemy lines, as if their coordinates had been deliberately leaked. Post-war investigations into these failures were quickly classified, sealed under the National Security Exemption Act, and buried beyond the reach of historians for decades. Even today, many files remain inaccessible, with key pages redacted under national security justification. The betrayal did not end with Arnhem. Subsequent operations in the Ardennes and the Ruhr Valley displayed similar anomalies: sudden gaps in intelligence, fuel shortages at critical moments, and supply convoys ambushed as if their routes had been exposed. A US Army counterintelligence report dated March 1945 warned of infiltration at levels beyond operational security, naming no individuals but urging extreme caution. That warning was ignored. Months later, during the Battle of the Bulge, entire divisions were encircled when German units appeared to anticipate Allied maneuvers with uncanny precision. The enemy's knowledge of Allied plans was explained away as luck or excellent reconnaissance, yet captured German officers confessed under interrogation that advance warnings had been provided through high channels. Why would Allied leadership allow this? The answer lies in the brutal pragmatism of geopolitics. By 1944, the question was no longer simply how to defeat Germany, but how to shape post-war Europe. Documents from the Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, suggest that selective sacrifices were tolerated in order to strengthen bargaining positions against the Soviet Union. If certain bridges were lost, if certain divisions were weakened, it was justified in the long view of securing Western control of industrial zones in the Rhineland. The soldiers on the ground, however, paid the price in blood. The implications are staggering. If Market Garden was compromised by design, then thousands of Allied soldiers were sacrificed not by the enemy's strength, but by the hands of those sworn to lead them. Families who received letters blaming the fog of war may have unknowingly mourned the victims of a deliberate betrayal. The grand narrative of Allied unity fractures under the weight of these revelations, exposing fault lines of mistrust and clandestine rivalries that shaped the outcome of the war as much as any battle. The final blow to trust comes from what followed after 1945. Those suspected of treachery were not prosecuted. Instead, some were quietly reassigned into intelligence roles during the Cold War. The logic was merciless. Men who could play both sides were invaluable in the new confrontation with Moscow. Files labeled transition asset describe individuals once suspected of collaboration with the enemy, now recruited into NATO's covert operations networks. The betrayal of Arnhem and beyond was buried, rewritten into the heroic myth of sacrifice, while the architects of deception lived on in shadowed service. To this day, the full truth remains obscured. Key files are missing from archives, often logged as destroyed in fire or lost in transfer. Veterans who raised questions found themselves ignored or silenced, and historians who petitioned for access to records encountered a wall of redactions, entire paragraphs blacked out under the justification of national interest. The few fragments that have surfaced are enough to paint a haunting picture. Market Garden may have been less a tragic failure than a deliberate act of calculated betrayal. A truth so disturbing, it calls into question not only the integrity of Allied leadership, but the very foundations of trust in the narratives we are taught to believe. Chapter 2. Forbidden Experiments Beneath Ravensbrück Walls. The official record describes Ravensbrück as a women's concentration camp, a place of forced labor, starvation, and death. Yet sealed within the archives of the US Army's Counterintelligence Corps lies a different account, one that transforms Ravensbrück from a site of punishment into a hidden laboratory of horror. Documents labeled Case File WN12 were withheld from the Nuremberg trials, their details suppressed not because they lacked evidence, but because they contained too much of it, evidence Western powers could not afford to release. At the heart of these papers are references to experiments so grotesque they read like nightmares disguised as medical research. Prisoners, many of them Polish resistance women, were subjected to injections of battlefield pathogens. Limbs were deliberately shattered and infected with dirt and glass to test surgical endurance. Chemicals intended for weaponized dispersal were forced into the lungs of the weak. Each procedure was documented with clinical precision, as if the agony of the victims were merely data points for future military application. One of the most disturbing discoveries in the file is a memorandum marked transferred paperclip. It suggests that several surviving doctors, once destined for trial, were instead rerouted through clandestine relocation programs. Operation Paperclip is often remembered for importing German rocket scientists such as Wernher von Braun to the United States, but this memorandum indicates it extended far deeper. Physicians complicit in Ravensbrück atrocities were quietly shipped to research facilities in Maryland, Texas, and Bavaria, where their expertise in chemical endurance and infectious disease could be exploited under new flags. The victims' suffering was converted into a classified asset, their torment sealed behind national security designations. The erasure was deliberate. During the Nuremberg medical trials of 1946 and 1947, testimonies describing these experiments were redacted from public transcripts. Survivors who spoke of chemical burns or deliberate mutilations were told their accounts were inadmissible hearsay, or that records had been lost. In truth, the documents were locked away under classified NATO relevance, because both Western and Soviet intelligence agencies sought to harness the same grisly data. Moscow, through its GRU networks, seized German medical archives as their armies advanced westward. Washington and London competed to secure what remained. Ravensbrück's horrors became currency in a silent war between former allies. Testimonies from survivors, later smuggled to the West, describe cold, sterile chambers where prisoners were strapped to metal tables under blinding lights. The sound of boots echoed against the concrete floors. Doctors in pristine uniforms spoke in measured tones, recording each reaction as if life and death were merely variables to be adjusted. Women were deliberately left untreated to study the natural progression of gangrene. Some were injected with untested anesthetics that induced paralysis without unconsciousness. Others were exposed to freezing temperatures, their shivering bodies monitored until silence confirmed death. Every detail was logged into leather-bound ledgers that disappeared into Soviet and American hands before the Red Army liberated the camp in 1945. For decades, whispers of these experiments lingered, dismissed by officials as exaggerations of traumatized minds. Yet fragments surfaced in unlikely places. A declassified CIA memo dated 1952 references German cold immersion data, directly linked to Ravensbrück trials. Another US Army report, stamped restricted distribution, reveals that chemical endurance findings from WWII were used to design protective gear for American troops in Korea. The implication is undeniable. The agony inflicted at Ravensbrück was not erased but repurposed, feeding into scientific and military projects presented to the public as innovations of the post-war era. Soviet archives tell a parallel story. Files seized by Smersh in 1945 describe shipments of biological samples transported from Ravensbrück to secret facilities near Novosibirsk. Defectors later testified that the Soviet Union attempted to replicate the experiments, using political prisoners in the gulags as unwilling test subjects. Thus, the atrocities did not die with the Third Reich. They were reborn under new banners, justified as necessary sacrifices for national security. Ravensbrück's victims were silenced twice, first by the knives and chemicals of their captors, and later by the governments who concealed their suffering. One cannot overstate the moral collapse represented in these files. At Nuremberg, Allied prosecutors stood before the world and declared that crimes against humanity would never again be tolerated, that justice would prevail without compromise. Yet behind the curtain, those same powers negotiated immunity for perpetrators who possessed useful knowledge. Justice was traded for leverage. Truth was bartered for supremacy in the emerging Cold War. The women of Ravensbrück, reduced to nameless subjects in medical logs, were denied even the dignity of having their suffering acknowledged. Their torment became the foundation for programs cloaked in secrecy, their voices erased from history so that intelligence agencies could claim progress untainted by atrocity. The chilling reality is that the legacy of Ravensbrück extends far beyond the walls of that camp. Every time a soldier dons protective gear against chemical exposure, or a new anesthetic is tested for battlefield surgery, echoes of those forbidden experiments linger. The world's advances in understanding hypothermia, chemical resilience, and infectious disease owe a debt that no nation dares admit. These are not triumphs of science, but the harvest of suffering. To acknowledge this fully would dismantle decades of carefully maintained narratives about Allied moral superiority and the purity of post-war justice. The surviving fragments of case file WN12 force us to confront a truth that governments across the globe have worked tirelessly to bury, that Western powers and Soviet authorities alike were complicit in erasing atrocities for the sake of advantage. Ravensbrück was not just a concentration camp. It was a crucible of cruelty, a hidden laboratory whose data shaped the Cold War itself. Its victims were written out of history, their agony sealed away in classified cabinets, while the perpetrators walked free, protected by the very nations that had sworn to bring them to justice. This is why the story remains forbidden. To release the full record would not only expose the depths of Nazi barbarity, but also implicate the victors in crimes of silence and complicity. It would reveal that the torch of justice, so proudly carried in the ruins of Nuremberg, was quietly extinguished when it threatened to illuminate truths too dangerous for the world to face. And so the files remain buried, locked in government archives, waiting for the day when secrecy no longer shields the guilty and the dead can finally be heard. Chapter 3: Erased Massacres Behind Eastern Front Lines. The official narrative of the Second World War frames the Soviet Red Army as the liberators of Europe, the force that bore the heaviest burden and finally drove the Nazi war machine into submission. Moscow's propaganda machine, amplified across occupied territories, reinforced the image of the Red Army as both heroic and righteous. Yet locked away in Soviet-era archives and corroborated by fragments of Allied intelligence lies a buried story that undermines this image. Systematic massacres, deportations and atrocities committed by advancing Soviet forces erased from official memory. These events were meticulously documented in files labeled SMERSH 47B, hidden under layers of classification until whispers emerged during the late 1980s, when defectors and released documents began to reveal fragments of the truth. As the Red Army crossed into Poland in 1944 and pushed further west into East Prussia, reports began to surface of entire villages razed, civilians executed without trial, and mass deportations into Siberian labor camps. Intelligence officers from the Polish Home Army, who had initially greeted Soviet soldiers as allies against the Nazi occupiers, quickly realized that liberation came at the price of submission or death. Field notes recovered after the war describe Soviet units entering towns such as Nemmersdorf in East Prussia, where women and children were slaughtered in acts of reprisal and dominance. German propaganda seized upon these events at the time, but what was dismissed as enemy exaggeration was later confirmed in chilling detail by Soviet reports never intended for outside eyes. Western intelligence agencies were not unaware of these crimes. OSS briefings from 1945, recovered in fragments, contain intercepted transmissions describing mass executions carried out by the NKVD, often under the justification of security cleansing. Lists of Polish intellectuals, clergy and community leaders were compiled and methodically targeted for elimination, echoing the earlier Katyn massacre of 1940, in which over 20,000 Polish officers were executed by Soviet security forces. The massacre at Katyn was officially denied by Moscow for half a century, blamed on the Germans, yet both British and American intelligence knew the truth as early as 1943. They chose silence for political expediency, unwilling to jeopardize the alliance that was vital to defeating Hitler. The same silence surrounded the massacres that followed. During the Red Army's westward surge, defectors from Soviet intelligence later described coded orders under the designation Order, or 428, which sanctioned scorched earth tactics and punitive actions against any population suspected of collaboration or resistance. In practice, this meant indiscriminate violence, civilians shot for sheltering retreating Germans, villages burned to the ground as examples, and women subjected to mass sexual violence. Estimates from suppressed files suggest that in East Prussia alone, tens of thousands of civilians were executed or deported between late 1944 and early 1945. Yet these figures never entered the public record, erased in the name of post-war unity and the fragile illusion of a morally unambiguous victory. American and British officials faced a harrowing dilemma. Declassified correspondence between Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt reveals coded language acknowledging irregularities committed by Soviet troops. Yet when Polish leaders in exile pressed for public recognition of the atrocities, their appeals were dismissed or suppressed. In one chilling telegram, an OSS officer stationed in London noted, "The need to preserve Soviet cooperation outweighs the present grievances of Poland." It was a brutal calculus. Justice for the victims was sacrificed to preserve the alliance that would end the war. In the years that followed, this silence calcified into official denial, reinforced by Soviet censorship and Western reluctance to reopen wounds. The erasure was thorough. Soviet-controlled tribunals convicted German officers for massacres they had not committed, fabricating evidence where necessary to obscure Soviet crimes. Archives in Moscow were locked, their contents restricted to a handful of trusted officials. Historians who attempted to investigate faced intimidation, imprisonment, or worse. In Eastern Bloc countries, any suggestion that the Red Army had committed atrocities was branded as fascist propaganda, punishable by imprisonment under laws against anti-Soviet agitation. For decades, the victims remained voiceless, their suffering erased not only from textbooks, but from collective memory itself. It was only in the twilight years of the Soviet Union that fragments of the truth resurfaced. In the late 1980s, as glasnost opened limited space for dissent, survivors of deportations and massacres began to publish memoirs long suppressed. Documents smuggled from Moscow confirmed what had been whispered for generations. The liberators had also been executioners. Yet even as the Soviet Union collapsed, Western governments hesitated to confront the full scale of these revelations. To do so would require acknowledging decades of complicity, decades of silence in the face of evidence they had long possessed. The moral implications are devastating. If the Red Army, celebrated as the force of liberation, committed atrocities equal in scale to those of the Wehrmacht, the entire framework of wartime morality collapses. Liberation becomes indistinguishable from conquest, and the distinction between victor and criminal blurs into shadows. For the families of those massacred in East Prussia, Poland, and the Baltic states, history offered no justice, only silence. Their villages disappeared from maps, their graves unmarked, their names erased from official records. They were casualties not just of war, but of deliberate historical amnesia. The surviving fragments of Smersh 47B and corroborating OSS reports leave us with an unsettling truth. The war's end was not the clean victory portrayed in textbooks, but a transition from one brutal occupier to another. The Red Army may have driven the Nazis from Eastern Europe, but it did not bring freedom. Instead, it brought repression, violence, and decades of silence. To acknowledge this fully would shatter the trust placed in the victor's narrative, a trust already frayed by decades of deception. The erased massacres of the Eastern Front remind us that history, when told selectively, is not truth. It is propaganda. And the price of that propaganda was measured in the lives of those who never lived to tell their story. Chapter 4: Hidden Negotiations with Nazi Elite. The accepted history of World War II insists on unconditional surrender, that the Allies refused to negotiate with the Nazi regime until its complete collapse in May 1945. But files long buried in the OSS archive, some stamped Eclipse Deep, tell a far darker and more complicated story. These records reveal that as early as 1943, clandestine back-channel negotiations were already underway between Allied representatives and select members of the Nazi elite. Conducted in neutral cities such as Bern, Stockholm, and Lisbon, these discussions were never meant to reach the public eye. Their goal was not peace for its own sake, but the selective survival of certain individuals and institutions within the Nazi state. Industrialists, intelligence officers, and SS leaders whose knowledge or influence was deemed too valuable to discard. In effect, the Allies and the Nazis quietly bartered lives, justice, and truth in the shadow of war. The Bern negotiations, referred to in coded messages as Operation Sunrise, are the most well-documented example. Swiss intermediaries facilitated meetings between SS General Karl Wolff, a high-ranking officer in Himmler's circle, and American intelligence agents under the OSS. Wolff was directly implicated in deportations and massacres across Italy and Eastern Europe, yet these details were conspicuously absent from later Allied reports. Instead, the focus was on securing his assistance in arranging the surrender of German forces in northern Italy. In exchange, Wolff was shielded from prosecution at Nuremberg and quietly integrated into post-war intelligence networks. His case was not an anomaly, but part of a larger pattern in which individuals tied to atrocities were spared in return for their usefulness. The same pattern can be traced in industrial and financial sectors. Corporations that had profited from Nazi-forced labor, such as IG Farben, Siemens, and Krupp, were ostensibly dismantled during post-war tribunals. Yet files uncovered in the 1970s suggest that their ownership structures were quietly preserved, with sanitized leadership installed to maintain operations vital to Western economies. One OSS memorandum, stamped Eyes Only, describes negotiations with German bankers in neutral Portugal to safeguard assets in Swiss accounts. These accounts contain not only stolen wealth from occupied Europe, but also the financial skeleton of corporations that would later rebuild under new names. The economic might of post-war West Germany was not a miracle of renewal, but the product of deals struck in secret to preserve networks of influence and capital. The betrayal extended to the realm of intelligence. Reinhard Gehlen, chief of Nazi military intelligence on the Eastern Front, was directly responsible for overseeing networks that facilitated atrocities against Soviet civilians and partisans. Yet immediately after the war, Gehlen and his staff were courted by American intelligence. His vast archive of Soviet military data was considered indispensable for the coming Cold War. Within months, Gehlen was resettled under US protection. His organization rebranded as the Gehlen Org, and later absorbed into the founding of West Germany's Bundesnachrichtendienst, its federal intelligence service. This was no accident. It was the calculated repurposing of Nazi structures to serve Western strategic interests. The files reveal that American officials were fully aware of Galen's record, but chose utility over justice. Britain, too, was complicit in these negotiations. MI6 records describe contacts with Nazi scientists in Copenhagen and Stockholm, offering protection in exchange for advances in rocketry, jet propulsion, and chemical warfare. These overtures overlapped with American efforts under Operation Paperclip, which sanitized the records of men like Werner von Braun, whose V-2 rockets had devastated London and Antwerp. The West justified these deals as necessary to counterbalance Soviet advances, yet in doing so, they dismantled the moral clarity of victory. Justice was promised to the world, yet immunity was granted in smoke-filled rooms where men weighed human suffering against strategic advantage. The Soviets were no less guilty. NKVD and GRU agents hunted the same Nazi scientists, engineers, and intelligence officers, offering them survival in exchange for service. Soviet archives reveal files on SS officers relocated to Moscow, their war crimes erased in return for contributions to Soviet weapons programs. In this global competition, the victims of the Third Reich became bargaining chips, their lives forgotten as former enemies became assets in a new, colder war. What the Allies denounced in public, they facilitated in secret, all while maintaining the illusion of moral purity. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that these negotiations were not limited to individuals, but extended to entire institutions. The Vatican, long accused of enabling Nazi escape networks through the so-called rat lines, worked in tandem with Western intelligence to facilitate the relocation of select Nazi figures to South America. Argentina, under Juan Perón, became a haven for hundreds of fugitives who had quietly secured their survival through back-channel guarantees. Files marked Eclipse Deep hint at OSS awareness of these networks, but instead of shutting them down, officials monitored them, considering them useful channels for gathering intelligence during the post-war diaspora of Nazis across the globe. The sanitized post-war narrative of unconditional surrender collapses under the weight of these revelations. The Allies presented themselves as paragons of justice, defenders of humanity, and destroyers of tyranny. Yet their secret negotiations reveal a darker truth, that justice was conditional, victory was transactional, and morality was negotiable. Those who could offer value in the next conflict were spared, while countless lesser figures faced the gallows at Nuremberg. The line between guilty and forgiven was not drawn by law, but by utility. What remains most haunting is how effective the erasure was. Textbooks speak of Nuremberg as the ultimate reckoning, yet omit the names of those quietly saved. Political speeches hail the triumph of democracy over fascism, while ignoring the compromises that preserved Nazi influence in the very fabric of the West. The public, fed a narrative of absolute justice, was never meant to know the transactions that shaped the world after 1945. These files, buried for decades, fracture that narrative, revealing a victory stained not only by blood, but by betrayal. The reality of these hidden negotiations dismantles the trust upon which post-war legitimacy was built. If the victors were willing to barter with the very men they condemned, then the moral clarity of the war dissolves into hypocrisy. The world was told that Nazism had been destroyed, but in truth it was reshaped, repurposed, and allowed to survive within the shadows of the Cold War. The victors did not destroy the machine. They simply rewired it for their own ends. Chapter 5. Disturbing Truths Behind. Hiroshima Decision. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 are etched into history as the acts that ended the Second World War. For generations, the justification was clear and unchallenged. Japan would not surrender without a dramatic, decisive shock, and the bombs saved countless lives by preventing a bloody invasion of the Japanese mainland. Yet declassified memoranda, intelligence intercepts, and suppressed military assessments paint a far darker picture, one that suggests the destruction of two cities was not simply an act of military necessity, but a calculated geopolitical maneuver aimed at reshaping the post-war world. Documents marked Trinity Alpha, once buried in US War Department files, reveal that Japan was already seeking conditional surrender by mid-1945, and that these overtures were deliberately ignored to justify the use of atomic weapons. intercepted Japanese diplomatic cables, decoded under the MAGIC program, show that by July 1945, Japanese envoys were seeking Soviet mediation to end the war. These communications, passed to American decision-makers, make clear that the Japanese government was prepared to accept surrender terms if the emperor could be preserved. Yet when these signals reached Washington, they were suppressed or downplayed in official briefings. General Dwight Eisenhower, Admiral William Leahy, and even General Douglas MacArthur privately argued that Japan was on the brink of collapse. Its navy destroyed, its cities reduced to ashes by conventional firebombing, and its supply chains strangled. But these warnings were drowned out by advocates of the bomb, who saw in it not just a weapon to end the war, but a demonstration of absolute power at the dawn of the Cold War. One telling memorandum from Secretary of War Henry Stimson to President Harry Truman, dated July 1945, emphasizes not Japanese military resistance, but the strategic implications of first use. The Soviet Union was preparing to enter the war against Japan, a move that could give Moscow significant leverage in Asia. By dropping the atomic bomb before Soviet troops advanced, Washington could not only force Japan's surrender, but also send a chilling message to Joseph Stalin. The United States now held the ultimate weapon. The decision was as much about shaping post-war geopolitics as it was about ending World War II. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became the first pawns in the new confrontation between East and West. The military assessments hidden in Trinity Alpha make the official narrative even harder to accept. The US Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted in 1946 but withheld from the public for years, concluded that Japan would have surrendered prior to November 1st, 1945, even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. Yet this report was buried, its findings suppressed to protect the narrative that the bombings were unavoidable. The idea that tens of thousands of civilians were incinerated not to save lives, but to display power, was too dangerous for public knowledge. Eyewitness reports from Hiroshima describe a city consumed in an instant. Shadows burned into walls, rivers filled with the charred remains of men, women, and children. Nagasaki, struck days later, was not even the original target. The city was chosen after Kokura was obscured by clouds. The decision was not carefully calibrated, but opportunistic. A rush to demonstrate the new weapon twice before Japan surrendered. Truman's diary entries from July 1945, released decades later, contain passages where he acknowledges Japan's weakened state, yet insists the bomb must be used to ensure American dominance in the post-war order. His words suggest not desperation, but determination to wield the bomb as a political instrument. The Soviet perspective confirms this interpretation. Stalin, informed of the atomic bomb test at Potsdam in July 1945, accelerated Soviet nuclear programs almost immediately. Soviet intelligence, already infiltrating the Manhattan Project through operatives like Klaus Fuchs, recognized the bomb not merely as a weapon, but as a declaration of intent by the United States to dominate the post-war balance of power. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then, were not only acts of war against Japan, but opening salvos in the Cold War itself. In this light, the victims of those cities were sacrificed not for peace, but for positioning in a struggle that would engulf the world for decades. The concealment of these truths was deliberate. American officials crafted a narrative of reluctant necessity, presenting the bombings as the least terrible choice in a war of annihilation. Schoolbooks, films, and speeches reinforced the idea that the bombs saved lives. Any suggestion that Japan was already seeking surrender was dismissed as revisionism or Soviet propaganda. Only decades later, through the release of censored reports and memoranda, did fragments of the suppressed truth surface. Yet even today, the mainstream story remains largely unchallenged, embedded in national identity and defended as moral justification. The disturbing reality is that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were less about ending one war than about beginning another. The United States used atomic weapons not solely to defeat Japan, but to intimidate the Soviet Union, to secure dominance in the post-war world, and to justify the massive costs of the Manhattan Project. The victims of the bombings were not only casualties of global war, but instruments in a demonstration of power, sacrificed in silence so that nations could redraw the map of the 20th century. The knowledge of this betrayal, long buried under layers of secrecy and denial, fractures the foundation of trust upon which official history rests. To accept this truth is to confront a devastating reality, that the greatest single act of destruction in human history was not a tragic necessity, but a calculated choice driven by politics and power rather than military need. The citizens of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became unwitting martyrs in a hidden war. Their deaths a message written in fire across the skies of a collapsing world. It is a truth so disturbing that even now many refuse to speak it aloud, preferring the comfort of a lie to the unbearable weight of what really happened in August 1945. For decades, the victors of the Second World War have preserved a story of clarity, a story where good triumphed over evil, where justice was delivered without compromise, and where the blood of millions secured a future free from tyranny. But as the sealed drawers of archives creak open and fragments of forbidden files slip into the light, the story fractures. Behind every celebrated battle lies the shadow of betrayal. Behind every proclamation of liberation lingers the echo of hidden atrocities, and behind every speech of justice rests the silence of deals struck in secret. The disturbing truths buried beneath World War II are not footnotes. They are revelations powerful enough to dismantle the trust placed in the victor's version of history. If the betrayal at Arnhem was real, if Ravensbrück's victims were silenced for science, if Soviet massacres were erased, if Nazi elites were spared through hidden negotiations, and if Hiroshima was chosen less to end war than to shape a new one, then the entire edifice of trust collapses. What else remains locked away in files marked classified, eyes only, or destroyed in transfer? What truths still wait in the dark, too dangerous for nations to admit, too corrosive for the public to bear? Perhaps history as we know it is not the story of truth at all, but the story of what powerful men decided the world should believe.